Welcome to the sinister side. Tonight, we journey into a chilling tale from a 19th century southern plantation where a proud owner, Charles, laughed off his wife Eleanor's growing fears, dismissing them as mere womanly worries. But everything changed the night their newborn son entered the world, for when Eleanor held him in her arms, the child's eyes, amber, piercing and impossibly familiar, stared back, belonging not to Charles, but to another man entirely. What follows is a twisted story of betrayal, secret liaisons, and a truth so corrosive it threatened to tear the entire household apart. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from, the time of day you're viewing, and make sure to subscribe to The Sinister Side for more dark, unforgettable stories. The plantation was a world wrapped in polished illusions. White columns that gleamed beneath the southern sun, winding brick paths that looked as if they'd been laid with meticulous care, and sprawling fields that breathed with every passing breeze. Everything about the estate was designed to project wealth, stability, and pride, and for strangers arriving at the tall iron gates, that image held firm. But Eleanor, the young wife of the plantation master, knew better than anyone that grandeur had a strange way of masking rot. She had lived inside those walls long enough to sense the quiet shifts in the air, the subtle tremors that came not from weather or labor, but from whispers that stirred when backs were turned. Even in moments of stillness, even when the world outside seemed peaceful, something inside her chest pressed against her ribs with a warning she couldn't silence. Eleanor had always been observant, the kind of woman who paid attention not only to what people said, but to the things they tried not to say, to the way someone's eyes darted, the tightening of a jaw, the hush of sudden silence when she approached a group. She noticed details without trying to, sensing patterns others missed, and though her husband, Charles, dismissed this awareness as needless worry, she had learned to trust it long before she ever stepped onto the plantation grounds. She had arrived at the estate as a bride scarcely 21 years old, with hopes much larger than her understanding of the world. Back then, the plantation felt enormous to her, like a living creature with its own heartbeat, the rustling of leaves, the creaking of wooden floors, the distant hum of work in the fields, all telling stories she didn't yet know how to interpret. In those first months, she tried to settle into her new life as the mistress of the estate. She oversaw meals, organized linen wardrobes, and attended to the expected rituals of polite southern living. But beneath her polite smiles and dainty nods, she had felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was the sense that she had entered a place that existed on two separate levels. One was the world her husband operated in: business, crops, land management, wealth and dominance. The other was a world of glances exchanged in dim corners, of uneasy footsteps behind closed doors, of words spoken softly enough to vanish the moment she tried to listen. That second world fascinated her and terrified her, though she never once admitted that to Charles. Charles Robertson was the kind of man who walked into a room expecting it to bend around him, his confidence bordered on arrogance, his laughter often sounding more like a proclamation than an expression of joy. He enjoyed being correct, being obeyed, being admired, and he seemed to thrive on the knowledge that he was the master of a vast enterprise. He had married Eleanor because she was beautiful and well-mannered, a perfect complement to the image he wanted to project. But he underestimated her mind from the moment he met her. He often told her that she worried too much, that she read into things, that she let her imagination play tricks. At first she accepted these remarks, replaying conversations in her head late at night, wondering if he was right. But the longer she lived on the plantation, the more certain she became that what she felt wasn't fantasy. It was the truth knocking softly, waiting for someone, anyone, to pay attention. Her suspicions began with the smallest disruptions. A window that had been open earlier suddenly closed when she returned to a room. Footsteps she didn't recognize echoing down the hall at odd hours. Voices drifting through the walls at night, too low for her to place but distinct enough that she knew they weren't imagined. She tried to explain these things to Charles once, during dinner, her trembling hands resting on the table as she described what she had heard. He laughed so loudly the silverware rattled. "My sweet Eleanor," he said between bursts of laughter. "You've been reading too many novels again. Perhaps I should lock away your books if they're causing you to conjure ghosts." His laughter continued long after her lips pressed shut. She didn't bring it up again. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the plantation held secrets she was not meant to uncover. The servants often acted strangely around her. Some avoided her gaze entirely, while others offered polite smiles tinged with unease. One evening, she caught two young girls whispering urgently in the laundry room, their hands working quickly as they folded linens. The moment they saw her, their faces drained of color before they curtsied and rushed out of the room without finishing their task. Eleanor stood alone by the window, staring after them, her heart twisting with a mixture of guilt and dread. She wondered if she had somehow frightened them, or if they knew something she was still stumbling toward blindly. Abram was the name that surfaced in her mind whenever she thought about these mysteries. He wasn't like the other men on the plantation. There was a calmness to him, an unspoken strength that drew attention even when he wasn't trying to stand out. He did his work quietly, moved with purpose, and carried a dignity that seemed out of place considering his position. Abram rarely spoke to her directly, but when he did, briefly, politely, she sensed a tension in his voice, as if he was holding back more words than he allowed himself to voice. At first she thought she was imagining the way the air seemed to shift when he walked by, but even the other workers appeared aware of him in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Some respected him, some feared him, some avoided him altogether. What unsettled her most was the way Charles reacted to Abram. He never mentioned the man by name, never acknowledged him in the presence of guests, yet Eleanor often caught him watching Abram with an intensity that bordered on hostility. There were moments when Charles's eyes narrowed just slightly, his jaw tensing before he looked away again. She couldn't tell if this was driven by suspicion, jealousy, or something darker, but she knew it was not nothing. Charles tried to pretend he had no reason to care about Abram, but his subtle reactions betrayed him in ways Eleanor noticed instantly. Once, when she asked a casual question about the workers, Charles brushed her off, saying, "There's no reason for you to concern yourself with them. They know their place." The way he said it made her skin crawl. Eleanor had never agreed with his harsh view of the world, but she had learned long ago that challenging him on moral grounds only led to long lectures and impatient sighs. Still, she couldn't ignore the unsettling connection, however vague, between her husband, Abram, and the strange energy sweeping through the plantation. Season after season passed, each one adding new layers to her unease. Summer brought nights thick with humidity and whispers floating through open windows. Autumn carried a sharpness in the air that made the entire estate feel fragile, as if one wrong breath could shatter the illusion of stability. Winter chilled the walls and made every footstep echo, amplifying the creaks in the floorboards that she struggled to ignore. Spring returned with blossoms in the garden, but also a disturbing sense of change she couldn't name. Through it all, Charles mocked her worries with the same indulgent amusement he gave a child, insisting monsters lived under the bed. Eleanor tried to ground herself in tasks, hoping the routine would ease her mind. She spent mornings inspecting household inventories, afternoons writing letters she never sent, evenings reading by candlelight, the faint glow causing shadows to dance on the walls. But even the shadows seemed to have stories of their own. Sometimes she would look up and feel certain that someone had just walked past the doorway, only to find the hall completely empty. Other times she would step outside to find workers glancing at her before quickly looking away, whispering under their breath. It was as though an invisible thread tugged at her from all directions, urging her to dig deeper, to understand what everyone seemed determined to hide. The confrontation between instinct and denial became a daily battle for her. She wanted desperately to believe Charles, believe that her fears were exaggerated, that the strange sensations were simply part of adjusting to life on a large estate. But every piece of evidence pulled her in the opposite direction, and the more she tried to ignore it, the louder the truth seemed to whisper. She found herself replaying small moments over and over again. The hollow look in Abram's eyes the day she saw him staring toward the main house. The way Charles froze one afternoon when Abram passed behind him. the hushed conversations she overheard between the older servants late at night. It all added up to something she wasn't ready to say aloud, but couldn't forget. Her dreams became restless, filled with images that made no sense. Shadows stretching down hallways, voices calling her name from distant rooms, a pair of eyes watching her from the darkness. She would wake gasping, clutching her chest, the sheets tangled around her legs like shackles. On mornings after those dreams, she often found Charles already awake and fully dressed, as if he had risen before dawn to avoid her. He never asked why she looked pale or exhausted, nor did he seem interested in the dark circles under her eyes. The distance between them widened day by day, fueled by his indifference and her suspicions. The turning point came on an afternoon when the sun shone too brightly, casting sharp, unforgiving light across the estate. Eleanor was walking along the side path that connected the main house to the garden when she saw Charles standing near the edge of the field, speaking in a low voice to one of the overseers. His posture was rigid, his expression unusually stern. She approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt, but something about the way he gestured toward the field tightened her chest. When he finally noticed her, he plastered on a strained smile and waved the overseer away. "Just business," he said with a shrug. "Nothing for you to worry about." But there was sweat on his brow despite the mild weather, and his hands were trembling slightly. She had never seen him so tense, not even in moments of financial pressure. It was clear he was keeping something from her, but she didn't press. She knew by then that pressing only drove him deeper into secrecy. That night, as she lay awake listening to the distant sounds of crickets, she couldn't shake the image of Charles standing rigid beneath the sun, staring toward the fields as if something inside them threatened his entire world. She thought of Abram again, his calm demeanor, his unusual quietness, the strange power he seemed to hold without ever speaking. The awareness she had tried to suppress for months twisted inside her, stronger and more insistent than ever. She began to realize that whatever secret haunted the plantation wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real, heavy, and tangled deep in the lives of everyone around her. And for reasons she couldn't yet understand, she was at the center of it. She didn't know then that the truth would soon reveal itself in the most devastating way possible. She didn't know that her instincts were not warnings, they were premonitions. Because the secret lurking in the shadows, the one she couldn't name or confront, was already unfolding behind her back. And when it finally surfaced, it would tear apart every illusion she had clung to, shaking the foundation of her life until there was nothing left but the pieces she never wanted to face. Eleanor's unease deepened in the weeks that followed, growing heavier with every passing day like a fog that refused to lift from her mind. The plantation continued its daily rhythm, workers moving across the fields in slow, practiced lines, overseers shouting commands, the kitchen fires burning from dawn until dusk. But beneath that routine, Eleanor felt an invisible tension stretching tighter and tighter, as though the entire estate was holding its breath. She moved through the halls with increasing caution, watching the doorways and the spaces between rooms, as if something hidden might reveal itself when she least expected it. Her husband, oblivious to the storm gathering inside her, continued to laugh off her concerns with the same dismissive charm he always used, the kind that sounded affectionate but never reached his eyes. But Eleanor was far from reassured. The small, unsettling things she once brushed aside had begun to form patterns she could no longer ignore. It began one morning when she decided to visit the East Wing storage area. She rarely walked that part of the house unless she had a reason, but that day she felt drawn to it for no logical explanation. As she stepped inside, the air felt strangely warmer than the rest of the house, and she paused, listening. Soft murmurs floated from the far corner, low enough that she could not make out the words, but clear enough that they weren't her imagination. She walked quietly, each step cautious on the wooden floor. When she rounded the corner, the voices went silent. Two workers stood there, holding crates, but their eyes widened at the sight of her. One dropped the crate, and the loud thud echoed through the room. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering. I didn't mean to startle you," she said, her voice barely steady. The men exchanged a quick glance, muttered an apology, and hurried past her so quickly the wind from their steps tugged at her dress. She stood alone, staring at the empty corner where they had been speaking. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but she still couldn't grasp what. Her thoughts often drifted back to Abram, the one person who seemed at the center of every strange ripple she felt. She tried to watch him discreetly, hoping to learn more about him without drawing attention, but she always ended up with more questions than answers. One afternoon, while walking near the horse stables, she saw him quietly repairing a broken beam. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, steady arms, and his movements were precise, deliberate. He didn't notice her at first, and she took the moment to observe him closely. He moved with a grace she hadn't noticed before, a fluid confidence that contrasted sharply with the harsh, tense energy of the overseers. But what struck her most was the look in his eyes. When he finally glanced up and met her gaze, she felt something heavy and complicated in that stare, not defiance, not fear, but something unreadable that made her breath catch. She nodded politely, he nodded back. The exchange lasted only seconds. She would lie awake, the blankets heavy on her legs, listening for the familiar creaks of the house settling. But instead of the usual sounds, she heard whispers drifting from the servants' quarters. These weren't the soft murmurs of casual conversation. They were hurried, urgent whispers that sometimes grew sharp enough for her to distinguish tones, even if she couldn't make out the words. She would rise from bed, wrap a shawl around her shoulders, and step into the hallway, hoping to catch a clearer sound. But each time she approached the source, the whispers vanished into silence like mist before the sun. One night she noticed candlelight flickering beneath the door of a room that was supposed to be empty. She hesitated at first, unsure if she should investigate, but curiosity and fear pushed her forward. When she opened the door, she found it completely empty. No candle, no people, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The room was dark, cold, and untouched. The only thing out of place was the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. She backed away slowly, her hand trembling on the doorknob. She wanted to tell Charles, but she already knew what his response would be. He would dismiss it, laugh at her again, and remind her how delicate she was. He didn't understand that she wasn't imagining things. She was sensing them, even when she didn't want to. Her suspicions sharpened one morning when the household was unusually quiet. Eleanor wandered downstairs, expecting to find servants preparing breakfast, but instead she found the kitchen nearly empty. Only one older woman remained, stirring a pot distractedly. When Eleanor asked where everyone else had gone, the woman hesitated before replying that a matter needed attending to by the field. Her hands shook as she spoke. Eleanor pressed gently, but the woman's eyes flicked toward the window and her mouth snapped shut. The fear in her expression was unmistakable. Eleanor excused herself, but her stomach twisted with dread as she stepped outside. She found herself drawn toward the field, though she couldn't explain why. Something deep in her bones urged her forward. When she reached the crest of the small hill overlooking the fields, she saw a group of workers gathered in a tight circle. They were too far away for her to see what was happening, but their rigid posture sent a chill down her spine. She scanned the crowd and caught a glimpse of Abram, not in the center but standing at the edge, watching with a solemn stillness that made her heart drop. Her instinct told her something serious had happened, but before she could move closer, Charles appeared from behind the group and walked briskly toward the house, his face stormy. She quickly retreated behind the garden wall so he wouldn't see her. When he passed, she heard him muttering under his breath, though she couldn't make out the words. She waited until he was gone before allowing herself to breathe normally again. For the remainder of that day, the plantation functioned in an eerie, robotic manner. Workers avoided eye contact, whispers spread like wildfire, and Charles locked himself in his study, refusing to come out even for supper. Eleanor knocked once, offering him a plate, but he shouted that he didn't want to be disturbed. She stepped back, startled. She had never heard his voice shake like that, not from anger, but from something closer to panic. She walked away slowly, trying to piece together why the entire estate seemed to be trembling beneath the surface. Over the next several days, she felt the plantation watching her. Yes, watching. Doors seemed to close just before she reached them, conversations stopped abruptly, and whenever she turned a corner, someone always seemed to hurry away. She tried to convince herself it was stress or coincidence or even paranoia, just as Charles always claimed. But she had lived long enough on this land to understand that the ground itself seemed to vibrate with secrets. Sometimes, while sitting at her writing desk, she would feel a sudden chill move across the room, even though the windows were closed. She began lighting extra candles at night, not for illumination but for comfort. Their soft glow made the shadows seem less menacing. One afternoon, while walking along the edge of the garden, she saw Abram again. He was standing alone near the old sycamore tree, staring at something she couldn't see. When she approached, he turned quickly, as though startled. She hesitated, suddenly unsure whether she should speak, but the words tumbled out anyway. "Is something happening here that I should know about?" she asked softly. His eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her. But then his expression closed off entirely. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Nothing at all." He bowed his head and walked away before she could say another word. She stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of his unsaid truths pressing down on her. The strange tension reached a breaking point the evening she overheard Charles and one of the overseers arguing near the barn. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She'd simply been taking her usual walk before dinner. But their raised voices stopped her in her tracks. She pressed herself against the wooden side of the barn, listening. The overseer was frantic, his words spilling out quickly. "You should have told her. She's not blind, Charles. She sees things." There was a long, sharp pause before Charles responded. "It doesn't matter. She won't figure it out. She's too trusting." His voice was harsh, trembling with anger or fear. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Was he talking about her? What was she not supposed to figure out? She stayed frozen in place until their voices faded, then quietly slipped away before they noticed her. As she walked back to the house, her heart pounded wildly. Everything she had sensed, everything she had feared, everything she had tried to ignore, it was all real. Something was happening behind her back, something Charles was desperate to hide. And it involved the workers, the overseers, and most likely Abram. From that night onward, her world felt different. Every sound was amplified, every shadow darker, every glance more suspicious. She moved through the house like a stranger in her own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. She knew she couldn't press Charles directly, not without consequences, but she also knew she couldn't continue pretending everything was fine. The secret was coming closer to the surface. She could feel it breathing against her neck in the quiet moments, whispering in her dreams, echoing in the strange looks people gave her. She just didn't know that the truth wasn't waiting to be uncovered. It was waiting to explode. When Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, the atmosphere changed entirely, not in small, gradual shifts, but in a single sweeping transformation that descended upon the estate like a storm cloud hiding the sun. The moment the physician whispered the confirmation, Charles reacted with an explosive joy that startled even the doctor. He lifted Eleanor from her chair, twirling her as though she were a delicate trophy rather than a trembling woman clutching the arms of her dress. Almost instantly he adopted the posture of a man who believed his life had finally aligned with divine destiny, a man convinced he had secured his legacy with a single successful act. He strutted through the halls with the arrogance of one who thought himself chosen by fate, tapping his cane with a louder rhythm, speaking with an inflated confidence that made every conversation a performance. Servants watched his transformation cautiously, unsure whether this pride was harmless or another shadow of the chaos they quietly feared. Charles wasted no time in spreading the news. He invited guests to celebrate, sending out elaborate letters written in his bold signature, sealed with wax, and handed to messengers who galloped from plantation to plantation. For weeks, visitors arrived in carriages, dressed in their finest attire, offering congratulations as though the baby were already born and promised to be a perfect heir. The house filled with laughter, clinking glasses, perfume, cigar smoke, and voices speaking loudly enough to drown out the soft anxieties of the woman at the center of it all. Eleanor stood among them, her hands resting gently on her still flat stomach, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, though inside her chest an unsettling flutter made it feel as though she were holding a frightened bird beneath her ribs. None of them saw the nights, the quiet hours when Eleanor woke drenched in sweat, trembling with a fear she could not voice. She dreamed of shadows that chased her through corridors she didn't remember walking, of whispers that curled like smoke around her ears, of secrets she had buried long before she ever set foot on the plantation. These dreams were not violent or dramatic. Worse, they carried the eerie familiarity of memories she had never consciously formed. She would wake gasping, palms pressed against her cheeks, unsure if she had screamed aloud or silently into her pillow. The darkness of her room would feel crowded, as though something unseen watched her from the corners, breathing softly but never stepping forward. She would curl onto her side, holding her belly, whispering to the child inside that she would protect it, though she did not know from what. The servants noticed her unrest even before Charles did. They saw her wandering the hallways late at night, a candle trembling in her hand, her eyes glassy as though she was seeing something from far away. They exchanged worried glances as Eleanor walked past them, clutching the railing as though the entire house were swaying. They whispered behind closed doors, their voices like wind slipping through cracks. Some speculated that Eleanor was simply overwhelmed by the weight of becoming a mother in a household ruled by a man as unpredictable as Charles. Others murmured that perhaps she held secrets deeper than anyone understood, secrets that her body, now vulnerable and open, could no longer keep contained. What unsettled the household even more was Abram's sudden disappearance. He did not leave entirely. Abram never left, but he retreated, slipping away into the hidden corners of the property where few dared to follow. For days at a time, no one saw him emerge. His chores were completed quietly, almost magically, as though done by invisible hands. Servants rarely glimpsed him except for brief moments when he crossed the yard at dawn, his face unreadable, his steps measured, his eyes avoiding everyone. The workers sensed something coiling around the plantation, something tightening like a rope pulled slowly with deliberate force. When Abram vanished for too long, they felt his absence like a pressure in the atmosphere, a reminder that something was shifting beneath the calm surface of daily life. Eleanor, despite everything, felt the weight of his disappearance more sharply than anyone else. She knew his silence was not ordinary. Abram had always moved like a man who accepted every burden placed upon him, a man who carried more than anyone realized, but who never allowed the strain to break his quiet resilience. Yet now he hid himself as though afraid of being seen, or perhaps afraid of what others might see in him. Eleanor wondered whether he knew her secret fear, whether he sensed that the child growing inside her was more than just a symbol of Charles's pride. Sometimes she imagined Abram's eyes following her steps, even when he was nowhere near, watching with a mix of sorrow and dread. At night she whispered his name into the darkness without knowing why. Something in her heart warned her that the birth of this child would expose everything, every lie she had spoken, every truth she had buried, every shadow that had stalked her silently throughout her years on the plantation. She sensed that the baby was a mirror, reflecting not only Charles's lineage, but the hidden fears she had tried to outrun. She felt the weight of past sins pressing against her ribs, growing heavier as her body changed, as though the child absorbed every secret woven into her history. She could not shake the feeling that the very act of bringing this child into the world would unravel the fragile fabric of her life, revealing threads she had stitched too quickly, too desperately, hoping no one would see the uneven seams beneath her elegant exterior. As the weeks passed, Charles's obsession with the unborn heir deepened. He paced the house with the impatience of a man who believed himself on the brink of triumph. He hired nurses, midwives, and even a personal physician to remain on standby, treating Eleanor as though she were made of porcelain. He insisted she rest on the veranda during the afternoons, reclining on cushioned chairs with quilts draped over her legs. He brought books, music boxes, and rare teas, eager to create an environment he believed would mold the child into greatness before it even arrived. Eleanor accepted these offerings without protest, but each gesture felt like a weight added to her chest, reminding her that she lived under a magnifying glass, Even as her stomach began to swell and her dresses were altered to fit her shifting form, the unease within her grew more tangible. Sometimes she felt as though the walls of the house were closing in, pressing their history against her skin, whispering their memories into her ear. The plantation had its own secrets, thick as the vines twisting around the veranda columns. Every creak in the floorboards seemed to say her name in a voice too familiar. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like a warning. Eleanor often walked barefoot across the cool wooden floors at night, just to feel the grounding of the earth beneath the house, as though she feared floating away into the vast unknown of her own spiraling thoughts. The more her fear grew, the more Abram's absence gnawed at her. She longed to speak with him, to ask him why he hid, what he feared, whether he sensed the same darkness creeping toward them. But she could not seek him out, not with Charles's watchful eyes, not with the servants whispering, not with the fragile balance of her life teetering under the weight of suspicion. She carried the secret quietly, pressing her fingers against her belly whenever the child moved, hoping the soft flutter beneath her skin would reassure her. Yet each movement felt like a reminder of the life she could not control, a force knitting itself together with threads she did not choose. There were days when the fear took hold so strongly that she could barely breathe. She would stand at the window, staring across the wide fields, watching the workers move slowly through the hot sun. The horizon shimmered with heat, the sky stretching endlessly, offering no comfort. She imagined running, truly running, through those fields, disappearing into the woods, leaving everything behind. But she knew she would not get far. Her condition tethered her to the house, to Charles, to the secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. One night, near the end of her 4th month, she woke again from a dream so vivid she felt its echo thrumming through her veins. In the dream, she walked through the nursery Charles had already begun to prepare, a room overflowing with blue satin ribbons, carved wooden toys, and a cradle polished to a gleaming shine. But in the dream, the cradle rocked violently, as though someone invisible pushed it. She approached slowly, her heart pounding, and when she reached out to steady it, a cold hand closed over hers. The hand was small, childlike, and yet its grip was impossibly strong. She tried to scream, but the sound dissolved in her throat. A voice whispered in her ear, soft and chilling, "Truth always comes." She jolted awake, gasping, her nightgown clinging to her skin with sweat. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and for a moment she could not remember where she was or whether the voice had followed her into the waking world. She pressed her back against the headboard, pulling the blanket to her chin, her breath ragged. After a long moment, she gathered enough strength to rise from the bed and walk to the window, hoping the night air would soothe her racing heart. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow across the yard, and there, for just a second, she saw a shadow moving near the old oak tree, a shape that looked unmistakably like Abram. She blinked, and the shadow vanished. Perhaps it had never been there. Over the next days, Eleanor's sense of dread only grew. She noticed things other people dismissed, doors that swung open without wind, mirrors that seemed to hold faint outlines of figures standing behind her, whispers drifting down the hallways with no identifiable source. She told herself it was stress, imagination, the strain of pregnancy, but deep down she knew better. She had always been sensitive to the undercurrents that others ignored, attuned to the quiet shifts in energy that signaled danger long before it revealed itself. And now, those undercurrents churned violently around her, like a river swelling before a flood. The servants grew increasingly uneasy as well. Some refused to enter certain rooms unless accompanied by another person. Others avoided eye contact, their steps hurried, their whispers urgent. Rumors spread silently through the quarters. Rumors about Eleanor's strange behavior, about Abram's disappearance, about the child that might not be the savior Charles believed it to be. A few dared to voice their suspicions in private, wondering whether this pregnancy would bring ruin rather than glory. Charles, oblivious to all of it, continued his celebrations. His pride swelled to such heights that he seemed deaf to the tension threading through the household. He planned elaborate gatherings, ordering fireworks and feasts, boasting that his son would one day inherit not just his wealth, but his unyielding courage and leadership. Eleanor flinched each time he said it, unsure whether she feared the lie more or the possibility that the truth would destroy them all. As her pregnancy progressed, Eleanor felt the strange duality of hope and dread twisting within her. She loved the child, she could feel that love blooming in her despite everything, but she feared what the child represented, feared the unveiling of truths she had never dared confront. She sensed that the child was coming not only to reshape her life, but to expose every hidden corner she had carefully darkened, and through all of it she felt the quiet, haunting certainty that the birth would not merely bring a child into the world, it would bring consequences. Consequences she was no longer sure she could escape. The day the child arrived, the sky hung unusually heavy, as though the clouds themselves were reluctant witnesses to what was about to unfold. A thick curtain of grey rolled across the horizon long before dawn, swallowing every colour the morning tried to offer. Even the birds, which normally filled the plantation grounds with sharp cries and restless movement, seemed to sense the tension that clung to the air like a warning. They remained strangely silent, their wings tucked, their presence hidden deep among the branches and rafters, as if nature itself refused to interfere with the events that were gathering momentum inside the house. The midwives, seasoned women who had overseen births in conditions far harsher than this, arrived early with their satchels and quiet solemnity. They moved through the hallways with careful steps, whispering to one another beneath their breath, as though mindful not to disturb the fragile balance that hovered between fear and expectation. Their eyes lingered too long on Eleanor's pale face, her trembling hands, the way she kept gazing toward the windows as thunder rolled softly in the distance. They exchanged looks, the kind women share when they know more than they dare speak aloud. They sensed something simmering just beyond the surface, an unspoken truth heavy enough to alter every life under that roof. Charles paced the length of the corridor just outside the birthing room, his boots clicking sharply against the polished wood floors. His movements were aggressive, almost triumphant, like a man marching in celebration of a victory already secured. His chest puffed with confidence, his chin held high, his expression brimming with pride. He muttered to himself constantly, rehearsing the words he would say to the guests who would undoubtedly congratulate him. "A son," he whispered under his breath again and again. "My heir, my blood, my legacy." At times he would pause by the doorway, listening to the muffled voices inside, and a flicker of impatience would cross his face. Then he would resume pacing, drumming his fingers along the windowsill, glaring at the storm clouds as if they too were taking longer than he wished. He had spent months bathing in the glory of impending fatherhood, relishing in the attention it brought. He had boasted publicly, basked in admiration, invited neighboring families to a celebratory dinner scheduled for the following week. He considered the birth a personal triumph, the final proof of his power, his influence, his masculinity. And yet, despite the confidence he shared with the world, he couldn't quite shake the faint unease that sometimes scratched at the back of his mind, an unease he drowned quickly with pride and denial. Inside the room, Eleanor lay drenched in sweat, her hair plastered to her forehead, her fingers knotted tightly into the sheets. She fought through each contraction with a mixture of resolve and silent terror. Something deep within her, something instinctive, something ancient, kept whispering that this day would tear apart the illusion she and Charles had lived beneath for far too long. Every push felt like a step toward inevitability, toward a truth she had been trying desperately to outrun. The midwives murmured encouragements, their hands firm but gentle, their faces carefully blank. They traded uneasy glances whenever Eleanor cried out in fear instead of pain, for they had seen fear in women before, fear of childbirth, fear of death, fear of the unknown. But this was something different. This fear had roots. This fear felt like the shadow of another person standing in the room, unseen but deeply present. Outside, the storm found its voice at last. Low rumbles rolled across the skies, shaking the window panes in their frames. The first droplets of rain tapped against the glass, slow and deliberate, like fingers knocking to be let in. The scent of wet soil and electric air seeped through the cracks along the sills. The flickering lamps cast wavering light across the room, stretching shadows unnaturally long. The midwives steadied the lamps each time the wind howled, as if trying to snatch them from their tables. Hours felt like days as Eleanor battled through waves of agony, gripping anything she could reach. Pillows, sheets, the wrist of the woman closest to her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her voice hoarse from cries she had tried to smother. And through it all a memory pulsed unbidden in her mind, amber eyes watching her in the moonlit corridor months ago, eyes that held something she had never been able to interpret, something that made her heart beat in ways it shouldn't have. Those same eyes haunted her now with relentless clarity. She squeezed her own eyes shut, willing the memory to vanish, but it clung stubbornly to her consciousness. With one final push, a sound tore through the room, a wail sharp and piercing, cutting through the storm as though commanding the sky itself to listen. The midwives sprang into action, their hands moving with practiced ease as they wrapped the newborn, cleaned his face, checked his breathing. The child screamed with ferocity, the cry rising and falling like a warning unfurled to every soul within range. Charles stumbled toward the door, gripping the frame as if the force of the wail had struck him physically. He turned his head sharply toward the noise, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. A slow smile curved across his lips. "My son," he whispered, savoring the words. Inside, Eleanor felt her heartbeat stumble and race all at once. She looked toward the bundle being lifted, her breath trembling as she waited for the face she had been dreading for months. One of the midwives approached her with unexpected hesitation, her steps faltering, her expression shifting from neutrality to something closer to alarm. She held the infant carefully, almost reluctantly, as though unsure whether placing him in Eleanor's arms would ignite a storm greater than the one raging outside. Eleanor reached out with trembling hands. The child, warm, small, impossibly fragile, was placed gently against her chest. His crying softened to whimpers as he settled into her warmth. For a moment she allowed herself to breathe, allowed herself the tiniest hope that perhaps her fears had been wrong after all. But then the baby opened his eyes. Eleanor gasped. Her fingers tightened reflexively, her entire body jolting with the shock of recognition. The child's face did share some of Charles's features, the shape of the jaw, the curl of the lips. But his eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. Amber, bright, piercing, luminous, impossible. Eyes she had seen before, eyes that had stared at her in whispered conversations, in silent hallways, in the dim glow of lantern light. Eyes that belonged to a man who should never have been part of her bloodline, never connected to her child, never woven into her story so deeply that it reached the cradle of her newborn. The midwives froze, each one recognizing immediately what Eleanor saw. The room became painfully still, the storm outside suddenly sounding distant compared to the suffocating silence inside. Eleanor couldn't tear her gaze away from those eyes, those striking amber eyes that seemed to hold secrets even the child couldn't possibly understand. Her stomach twisted, her breath splintered, her lungs felt too tight to contain the horror blooming within her. She whispered something, she wasn't even sure what, her voice barely audible, like the last thread of a dream unraveling. The midwives exchanged glances, their faces shifting from fear to dread to resignation. They had attended enough births to know what a resemblance looked like, what bloodlines did to a child's face. This resemblance, this was not an accident, this was a confession carved into flesh. One of the women swallowed hard and stepped back, almost instinctively, as though distance could shield her from the consequences that were surely about to erupt. The door creaked open behind them. Charles stepped into the room. His stride was confident at first, his expression fixed in the smug pride he had worn all morning. But that expression faltered instantly when he saw Eleanor's face, pale, stricken, trembling like a leaf caught between storms. He frowned, confused, then he moved closer. The child shifted slightly in Eleanor's arms, and the small motion drew Charles's attention downward. For a moment, time seemed to warp, stretch, twist unnaturally around the three of them. Charles leaned in, expecting to see a miniature version of himself, a reflection of his power, his legacy, everything he believed he had created. But instead, he found himself staring into eyes that did not belong to him. His breath hitched, his face drained of color, his jaw slackened. He blinked once, twice, as if waiting for the image to rearrange itself into something acceptable. But it didn't. It couldn't. Those eyes were not his. They were Abram's. The same burning amber, the same unmistakable fire, the same depth that Charles had seen all those months whenever the quiet worker dared glance in his direction. A shiver rattled through the room. The storm outside cracked open with a deafening roar of thunder, as if the sky itself could no longer contain the tension boiling within the walls of that house. Charles took a step back, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, his mind scrambling to deny the truth screaming at him from his own child's face. Eleanor clutched the baby protectively, though she wasn't sure if she was shielding the child from Charles or shielding herself from the explosion she knew was coming. And in that moment, as the storm raged and the lamps flickered, and the child stared with the eyes of another man, every lie, every betrayal, every whispered suspicion finally clawed its way into the open, where no one, not Eleanor, not Charles, not even the trembling midwives, could pretend not to see it anymore. The truth had arrived with the newborn, and there was no burying it now. The days that followed the child's birth were suffused with a tension so thick it seemed to seep into every corner of the plantation, settling on furniture, walls, and the very air Eleanor breathed. Even the sky seemed to brood with a persistent grey, refusing to clear, casting a shadow that matched the unease gnawing at her heart. From the moment she held the baby with those impossible amber eyes, Eleanor had understood that nothing in her life would ever return to normal. Charles's pride, once brash and self-assured, had shifted into something subtler, more dangerous, a quiet fury restrained by etiquette, controlled only by the awareness of witnesses and by the need to protect appearances. He continued to parade the child before guests, using him as a symbol of legacy, yet his gaze lingered too long in moments when Eleanor's back was turned, studying the baby as though searching for proof to dismiss the undeniable truth reflected in those eyes. His confidence, once unshakable, now had cracks running through it, almost imperceptible but enough for Eleanor to feel the tremors from across the room. She watched him carefully, studying every gesture, every tense line of his jaw, every shift in posture, knowing he was aware she could read him too, that he had to know she had already seen everything. Eleanor herself moved through the household with a delicate balance of observation and pretense. She held the child close, whispering to him in the quiet hours of the night, pressing her lips to his soft cheek, as though imprinting her own knowledge into his very being. At times, when the storm clouds outside mirrored the turmoil inside her, she would gaze into those amber eyes, searching for understanding in a soul too young to offer it. She felt an uncanny familiarity, as if the child carried with him the memory of truths she had only half-consciously known. Every flutter of his tiny hands, every gurgle, every soft sigh pressed the weight of the secret into her chest, reminding her that the child was both a blessing and a weapon, a living revelation that could expose what she had spent so long protecting. Even the servants, who had begun to whisper cautiously when Eleanor walked the halls, now shifted uneasily when the baby was near. There was a recognition in their glances, a fear tempered with awe, as though they too felt the potency of the child's presence. Eleanor noticed the subtle tilts of heads, the sudden silence that fell when she entered a room, the hesitant steps taken by those who approached the crib. She did not reprimand them. She understood that this was no ordinary household tension. This was a revelation made flesh, and every life under that roof had to adjust to it. Charles, meanwhile, attempted to assert control. He spent long hours with the child in his arms, whispering promises of inheritance, of power, of the greatness he believed his son was destined to achieve. But Eleanor watched his eyes betray him, and in those moments she realized that pride and fury were intertwined in a complicated dance. He feared what the child represented, even as he desired him. He feared the inevitable truth that the resemblance, undeniable and stark, could unravel everything he had built, while simultaneously he believed he could contain it, mold it, own it as he owned the land, the people, the very world around him. The tension between them was silent but palpable. Eleanor never spoke the word that hovered on her tongue. never accused, never questioned aloud, yet her presence, her quiet insistence on awareness, pressed against him with the force of inevitability. Abram, for his part, remained a shadow in the periphery. He appeared rarely, moving silently through the corners of the estate, his posture calm, his eyes fixed on tasks that no one else questioned. Eleanor sensed his watchfulness, a quiet attention that extended far beyond mere labor. At times, she thought she caught him staring at the child through doorways, through half-closed shutters, his expression unreadable, yet laden with a gravity that hinted at knowledge, at guilt, at protection. She did not confront him. Eleanor often paused in hallways, listening to the low hum of tension, feeling it resonate through her bones, through the wooden floors, through the very foundation of the plantation. The estate was alive with knowledge, and knowledge in that household carried a weight that few could bear without tremor. Eleanor's nights were restless, filled with dreams so vivid they left her breathless upon waking. She dreamt of herself in corridors stretching infinitely, of doors opening to reveal glimpses of people she had never met, yet who seemed intimately connected to the child. Shadows moved with deliberate intent, and whispers drifted from unseen mouths, speaking truths she feared to acknowledge in the waking world. She awoke at intervals to find the child in her arms, his amber eyes reflecting the lamplight in ways that felt almost unnatural, as if they saw more than the room, as if they recognized the unseen forces swirling around them. The midwives tried to assure her that newborns often stared in such ways, that eyes could seem knowing even in infants, but Eleanor knew differently. She could not shake the sense that the child's gaze held the weight of secrets, that his very existence demanded recognition of the lies and betrayals that had filled her life. Charles became increasingly erratic. His public demeanor remained polished, a mask of satisfaction and pride for the guests he continued to entertain, but Eleanor witnessed his private moments of fracture. He would pace the nursery late at night, muttering to himself, checking the child's face over and over, as if seeking some reassurance that the resemblance he feared was not true. When he believed Eleanor was not watching, he would place the baby in the crib and stand over him, breathing shallowly, his hands trembling despite every effort at control. Eleanor observed silently, cataloguing each movement, each twitch of his fingers, each falter in his carefully rehearsed composure. She began to understand that Charles's power, for all its outward assertion, had limits. The child had exposed them. The child had shifted the balance of control in ways he could not fully comprehend. As weeks turned into months, Eleanor's understanding deepened. She realized that the child was not simply an heir or a symbol of lineage. He was a catalyst, a force that would bring hidden truths into the light whether she, Charles, or anyone else desired it. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction became a negotiation of unspoken power. Eleanor learned to navigate the delicate spaces between hope and fear, love and survival, secrecy and revelation. She discovered resilience she had never known, a strength born from necessity, from the intimate knowledge that the child's very life carried stakes far beyond her own. She held him close during storms, whispered promises she did not fully understand, and prayed for guidance, even as her heart warned that no prayer could prevent the consequences that loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. Abram's presence remained constant yet invisible. Eleanor sensed his attention in subtle ways, a door left slightly ajar for her convenience, a shadow passing silently at the edge of a room, a watchful gaze she caught in mirrors or polished surfaces when she least expected it. There was a tension between them, unspoken, a fragile thread connecting the woman and the man, who both knew the truth about the child's eyes. Eleanor did not question him directly, and Abram did not offer explanations. Their understanding relied on instinct and mutual recognition of the dangerous knowledge they now shared. The child's birth had rewritten alliances and silences, and the two of them existed within that new world cautiously, carefully, aware that one misstep could unleash devastation. Outside, the plantation continued its rhythms, yet everything felt subtly altered. The fields, once alive with workers moving confidently under overseers' commands, now felt tense and watchful. Conversation ceased abruptly when Eleanor or Charles appeared, as though some invisible authority now governed every word. Even the natural world seemed to respond. The wind carried a restless energy. Animals became erratic, and the storm clouds lingered long after the rains had fallen. Eleanor noticed these changes with a mixture of fear and curiosity, understanding that the child had not only affected human lives, but had shifted the balance of existence itself on the estate. Social interactions became complicated. Guests who arrived to celebrate the heir often whispered behind gloved hands, noting the subtle intensity in Eleanor's gaze, the strange calm of Abram, the tense restraint in Charles. Their glances suggested knowledge they did not speak aloud, a shared awareness of the delicate tension reigning over the household. Eleanor tolerated their presence, answered polite questions, and smiled when expected, but her mind remained alert, scanning, analyzing, understanding the network of power, secrecy, and threat that now defined her every action. The child's existence had transformed Eleanor into an observer and a participant in a dangerous game she had never agreed to play. At times, the weight of all this knowledge threatened to overwhelm her. She would retreat to quiet corners, clutching the child, rocking him slowly, whispering her fears into his tiny ears. She did not know if he understood, if he would ever understand, but the act itself grounded her, gave her a measure of control in a life that had been irrevocably altered by circumstances beyond her choice. She would imagine conversations with Abram, planning silent strategies, imagining futures where truth and deception were constantly balanced, and she would allow herself a flicker of hope that perhaps they could navigate the perilous waters together. Charles, meanwhile, remained unpredictable. His mood swung from pride to paranoia, from confidence to subtle rage. Eleanor learned to anticipate his reactions, to avoid speaking truths that would trigger an eruption, to hide her knowledge of the child's resemblance when necessary. The household had become a theater of careful movements, precise words, and concealed intentions. Every glance, every sigh, every passing gesture carried weight, and Eleanor became adept at reading each of them, understanding the hidden signals, the undercurrents, the storms lying dormant beneath polite smiles. Months passed, and the child grew, carrying with him the silent power of revelation. His amber eyes watched, unblinking, aware beyond his age, reflecting the truths no one dared speak aloud. Eleanor understood that the child was both her burden and her shield, both her reason for caution and her reason for courage. She carried him close, whispered guidance into his tiny ears, and prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation with Charles and the unraveling of secrets that had shadowed the plantation for years. The world she had known had changed irrevocably, and there was no returning to the pretense of normalcy. Every heartbeat, every glance, every breath was now inextricably tied to the child's existence, to the truth that could no longer remain hidden. Eleanor's resolve strengthened with each passing day. She would not allow the child's birth to be reduced to a tool of pride or fury. She would protect him, nurture him, and prepare for the reckoning that would inevitably arrive. Charles's influence, Abram's watchfulness, the whispers of the servants, the gaze of neighbors, all were secondary to the silent power the child carried. Eleanor realized that she, too, had become a force, a guardian, a participant in a web of destiny far larger than she had ever imagined. And in that knowledge, amidst the stormy skies, the tense halls, and the quiet vigilance of all who lived under the same roof, she felt a strange, solemn sense of purpose, that no matter the cost, the truth would be acknowledged, the child would survive, and she would endure. The plantation, once a place of control and pretense, had become a crucible for revelations. Secrets could no longer hide, lies could no longer protect. The child's amber eyes, luminous and unwavering, would illuminate every corner of the estate, exposing all that had been buried in darkness. Eleanor understood this fully, and with each day she grew stronger, more determined, and more vigilant. Every heartbeat of the child resonated with the weight of the past, present, and future, and Eleanor accepted that her life, and the lives of all around her, would never again be the same. The days stretched on, filled with quiet tension, careful observation, and the unspoken acknowledgement of a truth that could no longer be contained. And Eleanor, cradling the child in her arms, understood that she had entered a new existence, one defined by vigilance, courage, and the unwavering knowledge that some truths are too powerful to remain hidden, no matter how desperately one might wish them to be.